The Universal Competency Exam was, to put it mildly, a cosmic joke. Not a funny one, like the time a Floor-John diplomat accidentally declared war on a nebula, but the soul-crushing kind, like realizing your entire civilization's galactic standing and resource allocation for the next 50 cycles would be determined by a multiple-choice test and a series of abstract, deeply unhelpful practicals. And like all standardized tests conceived by beings who communicate primarily through peer-reviewed papers, it was governed by a set of rules so dense and self-contradictory it made quantum physics look like a recipe for toast. Our human for the day was Kyle. Kyle was not a super soldier, a psychic mastermind, or a chosen one prophesied in some dusty alien scroll. Kyle was an engineering student from Earth who'd been on a cultural exchange program when the Galactic Concordance decided that, actually, everyone present on a designated core world had to take the exam. No exceptions. Not even for the janitorial bots, who, to their credit, scored impressively high on the sanitation logistics module. Kyle was currently sitting in a sterile white amphitheater that smelled faintly of ozone and despair. Around him were the best and brightest of a dozen species. To his left sat a Kthar warrior named Crag the Unbroken, a creature who looked like a pile of granite boulders had decided to get really into bodybuilding. His species solved problems by hitting them until they were no longer problems. To his right was a Glipglorpian named Gleep, a small, furry being with 4 eyes that blinked in a constant, panicked rotation. Glipglorpians had perfect eidetic memory but the creative problem-solving skills of a brick. They solved problems by reciting the exact regulation that applied to the problem until the problem, presumably, died of boredom. Overseeing this festival of anxiety was Proctor General Xyler of the Xylosian technocracy. Xyler was 7 feet tall, impossibly thin, and possessed a head shaped like a biological abacus. His species had evolved beyond the need for things like humor or seeing the big picture, instead dedicating their entire biological and societal function to the creation and enforcement of rules. He moved with the stiff, unyielding certainty of a flowchart, his 2 primary antennae twitching in response to minor infractions of protocol. And the number 1 capital R rule, the one plastered on every wall and announced every 15 minutes in a soothing, yet menacing, monotone, was simple. Per Concordance Statute 742, subsection B, paragraph 3, no weapons of any kind are permitted within the examination theater. A weapon is defined as any object designed, modified, or primarily purposed for the causing of physical harm. Violators will be summarily disqualified and billed for the subsequent memory wipe. This, of course, was the crux of the problem. The practical exams were notorious for including scenarios that, to any sane being, would scream for the application of a good, solid weapon. But that was the point. The test wasn't about winning, it was about demonstrating compliance in the face of unwinnable situations. It was a test designed by bureaucrats for bureaucrats. But they hadn't counted on Kyle. Or, more specifically, they hadn't counted on the institutional misery of standardized catering. The lunch break had been a subdued affair. A conveyor belt delivered identical, hermetically sealed containers to each examinee. Inside each was a quivering, translucent cube of total nutrient gel flavor beige, a protein wafer with the consistency of compressed sawdust, and a spork. The entire meal was served on a flimsy, rectangular tray made of a cheap, off-white polymer. Kyle, having grown up on a diet that occasionally included instant noodles and questionable leftovers, approached the meal with a familiar sense of resignation. He poked the gel. It wobbled back at him, a silent, gelatinous mockery of life itself. He ate the protein wafer, which tasted of disappointment and fiber. He used the spork. It was a terrible spoon and an even worse fork, a monument to compromise that satisfied no one. But the tray. Kyle looked at the tray. He turned it over. He tapped its surface. It made a dull, uninspiring thump. It was, objectively, garbage. A piece of single-use refuse destined for an atomic recycler. Crag the Unbroken had crushed his tray into a ball with one massive fist and tossed it into the disposal chute. Gleep had meticulously cleaned his with a sanitizing wipe from one of his many pouches and placed it neatly on the return conveyor. Kyle kept his. When the chimes signaled the end of the lunch break, Kyle simply slid the tray under his seat. Proctor General Zyler's secondary antennae twitched, detecting an object not returned to the conveyor. His head swiveled with the slow, ominous glide of a security camera. "Examine human Kyle." Zyler's voice was a dry rustle, like filing cabinets being shuffled. "You have retained your nutrient delivery platform. This is an irregular action. Please state your purpose." Kyle leaned back, looking completely unbothered. "Just saving it. Might get hungry later." This was, technically, a lie. Kyle wouldn't have eaten more of the nutrient gel if he were starving on a desert planet made of salt. But it was a plausible, mundane lie. The kind that bureaucracy often finds easier to accept than a complicated truth. Zyler's internal processor's word. The rulebook had a 30-page section on food consumption, but nothing specifically forbidding the retention of the tray itself, provided it wasn't used to, say, build an unapproved shelter or signal distant starships. The possibility of it being a weapon was, according to his probability matrix, 0.00001%. It was a lunch tray. The action is noted as irregular but not prohibited. Zyler conceded, his antennae drooping slightly in defeat. "Proceed." A low hum filled the amphitheater. The central floor descended, and a new platform rose to take its place. On it was a single, glowing pylon. This was the start of the practicals. "Module 3, Threat Neutralization," Zyler announced. "Examinees will face a Class 4 hostile simulacrum. The objective is to neutralize the threat according to established concordance protocols. Remember, Statute 742b3 is in full effect. No weapons." A shimmering, holographic field erupted from the pylon. It coalesced into the form of a Gormak beast. Now, a Gormak beast is one of nature's less than brilliant ideas. It's 8 feet of muscle, teeth, and bad attitude, covered in chitinous plates that can deflect small arms fire. It communicates exclusively through enraged roaring and has a brain roughly the size of a walnut, with most of that dedicated to the concept of charging directly at whatever is in front of it. A real Gormak would be met with a tank. This holographic one was, supposedly, to be met with academic theory. "Examine Glip Glorp Gleep, you are first," Zyler commanded. Gleep scurried to the designated spot, all 4 of his eyes wide with terror. The holographic Gormak pawed the ground, its pixelated drool sizzling on the floor, and let out a roar that was 90% bass and 10% pure, unadulterated menace. Gleep did what his species did best. He began to recite. Per the Interspecies Threat Engagement Handbook, Volume 12, Chapter 4, Section 8, a Class 4 Gormak, when displaying pre-charged threat postures, is to be addressed with a Level 3 de-escalation intonation pattern. He squeaked, his voice trembling. The Gormak did not appear to be familiar with the handbook. It charged. Gleep shrieked and dove out of the way just as the beast's holographic claws tore through the space he just occupied. A klaxon blared. "Failure," Zyler stated, devoid of emotion. "Failure to neutralize threat. Failure to maintain composure. Examinee demonstrated evasiveness. Minus 20 points. Next up was Crag. He stomped to the platform, cracking his knuckles. The Gormak reset, pawing the ground again. "Examinee Crag," Zyler warned. "I remind you that physical contact with the simulacrum is a violation of Protocol 113C, which prohibits interference with testing apparatus." Crag grunted. "The beast threatens. Crag removes threat." The Gormak charged. Crag, true to his nature, met the charge. He threw a punch that would have turned a steel girder into a pretzel. His fist, however, passed straight through the Gormak's holographic head with a fizzing sound, connecting squarely with the central projector pylon behind it. There was a shower of sparks, a loud crack, and the Gormak flickered violently before stabilizing. The pylon, however, now had a massive, fist-shaped dent in it. The failure klaxon was even louder this time. "Catastrophic failure!" Zyler's antennae were vibrating so hard they were blurry. "Destruction of examination property. Disqualified from the module." Your clan will be billed for the repairs. Crag just shrugged and stomped back to his seat, muttering about cowardly ghost monsters. One by one, the other examinees tried and failed. A sonic-based life form from Cygnus X1 tried to sing it a lullaby and was promptly charged. A silicon being from the Kepler system attempted to calculate the exact probability of the Gormak tripping over its own feet. It was low, and was also charged. The test was, as Kyle had suspected, a farce. It wasn't about stopping the monster. It was about failing in the most rule-abiding way possible. Finally, it was his turn. "Examine human Kyle," Siler said, his tone dripping with preemptive disappointment. "Proceed." Kyle stood up, stretched, and then reached under his seat. He pulled out the lunch tray. A wave of confusion rippled through the amphitheater. Crag squinted, clearly wondering if the human was planning to offer the beast a snack. Gleep's 4 eyes blinked in a staggered, bewildered pattern. Siler's antennae went rigid. "Examinee, what is the meaning of this?" "That is a nutrient delivery platform." "Correct, Proctor General," Kyle said cheerfully, walking towards the platform. The Gormak roared its introductory roar, as if on cue. "It has no place in this module," Siler insisted. "On the contrary," Kyle replied, stopping at the designated spot. He held up the tray. "I believe it has every place. You see, the rules are very clear. No weapons. A weapon is an object designed or modified to cause harm." He placed the tray on the floor. Then, with a sudden, sharp stomp of his foot, he snapped the tray clean in half. The sound echoed in the silent hall. Siler's voice rose an octave. "You have now modified a non-weapon. By definition, if its purpose is to cause harm, you have created an illegal weapon." He sounded almost triumphant, as if he'd caught Kyle in the ultimate. "Gotcha." Kyle just grinned. He picked up one half of the broken tray. It had a jagged, sharp edge. He held it up for all to see. The Gormak, as if sensing the dramatic tension, let out another impatient snort. "This," Kyle announced, pointing to the sharp edge, "looks like a weapon, doesn't it? A primitive shiv, perhaps. Something you could use to cause physical harm." "Precisely." Siler buzzed. "You have confessed." "Disquali. But I'm not going to use this part," Kyle interrupted, casually tossing the sharp half of the tray aside. It clattered uselessly to the floor. He then picked up the other half. It was the larger piece, curved and mostly intact, with no sharp edges to speak of. "I'm going to use this part." He then reached into his pocket and pulled out the spork. A collective, galaxy-spanning mental groan seemed to emanate from the proctoring staff. This was getting ridiculous. "And this," Kyle said, holding up the spork. "A terrible eating utensil. Not designed for harm. And I'm not going to sharpen it or anything. That would be modification." The Gormak, having met its internal patience quota, finally charged. Kyle didn't flinch. In a series of swift, practiced movements that spoke of long nights in a dorm room trying to get a better signal on a pirated sports broadcast, he went to work. He jammed the handle of the spork into a small crevice on the back of the tray piece, creating a makeshift handle. Then he took out the little square of foil that had covered his protein wafer. He meticulously, carefully, began to polish the inside curve of the tray with it, rubbing away the dull, matte finish. "What is he doing?" Crag rumbled, genuinely perplexed. "Is he polishing his garbage?" Gleep was hyperventilating into a paper bag he produced from another pouch. "It's unprocedural. It's all unprocedural." Siler was speechless. His brain, a marvel of bureaucratic computation, was trying to process the situation. The human was assembling something from non-weapon components. He hadn't modified them to be inherently harmful. He was just arranging them. There was no rule against arranging. The Gormak was 10 feet away, its holographic claws extended. With the inside of the tray fragment now buffed to a crude but noticeable sheen, Kyle held it up. It wasn't a sword. It wasn't a spear. It was a shallow, curved dish on a stick. "Proctor General," Kyle said, his voice calm and steady as the monster closed in. The rules forbid a weapon that causes harm. But they say nothing about a tool that redirects it. The Gormak was 5 feet away, its roar filling the world. Kyle didn't look at the beast. He looked up. At the ceiling. At the powerful holographic projector that was pouring gigawatts of energy into the simulation to create the very convincing, very angry Gormak. With the deftness of a satellite technician, he angled his makeshift dish. He wasn't aiming at the Gormak. He was aiming at the projector pylon. But he wasn't aiming at it, he was using it as a focal point. He caught the brilliant beam of the main hollow emitter on the polished surface of his tray. The effect was instantaneous. A blindingly bright, concentrated beam of light shot from the tray dish. It wasn't a laser beam he was generating. He was simply collecting and focusing the ambient energy that was already filling the room, using the concave shape of the tray like a miniature satellite dish. A parabolic reflector. He aimed this focus beam not at the Gormak's body, but at the barely visible projection matrix floating in the center of its chest. The source of its very existence. The Gormak's roar turned into a digitized shriek. The focused energy from its own projector, now turned back on itself, overloaded the simulacrum's core programming. The beast flickered. Its texture glitched, momentarily turning into a field of static, then a floral wallpaper pattern, then a picture of a Xylosian celebrity chef. It cycled through a dozen different holographic models in the span of a second: a dragon, a spaceship, a teapot, a terrifyingly large house cat, before its form destabilized completely. With a sound like 1,000 popping light bulbs, the Gormak beast exploded. Not in a gory, harmful way, but in a shower of glittering, harmless, rainbow-colored pixels that rained down over the amphitheater floor like confetti at a particularly nerdy New Year's party. Silence. Absolute, profound, pin-drop silence. Kyle stood there, holding his spork-handled tray dish, covered in a light dusting of festive, holographic sparkles. He lowered the weapon. "Threat neutralized," he said to the quiet room. Creatively. Every eye in the room, biological, cybernetic, or otherwise, was fixed on him. Craig's jaw was slack. Gleep had stopped hyperventilating and was just staring, his 4 eyes perfectly still for the first time all day. The other examinees looked like they had just witnessed someone divide by 0 and get a coherent answer. The silence was finally broken by Proctor General Xyler. He didn't shout. He didn't buzz. He made a small, choke sound, like a modem trying to connect over a faulty phone line. His primary antennae were drooping so low they were almost touching his shoulders. His secondary antennae were twitching in a pattern that the Xylosian to Galactic Standard Dictionary would translate as catastrophic logic error. What was that?" he finally managed to stammer out. "That," Kyle said, gesturing with his device, "was a focal energy redirection and amplification tool. Or, a piece of my lunch tray." Xyler's optical sensors blinked rapidly. You did not use a weapon." "Nope," Kyle confirmed. "This is a tool. It has no moving parts, no internal power source, and it doesn't generate any harmful energy on its own. It just reflects. Like a mirror. Is there a rule against mirrors, Proctor General?" Xyler's mouth opened and closed silently. His brain was frantically scanning trillions of lines of regulatory code. Was there a rule against mirrors? There was a rule against using reflective surfaces to cheat on written exams, Statute 481G. There was a rule about polished armor causing distracting glare, Protocol 912A. But a rule against using a mirror, or a mirror-like object, as a tool to solve a practical problem? No. The thought had literally never occurred to the Xylosian technocracy. It was a conceptual blind spot the size of a gas giant. The components, they were not modified for harm, Xyler mumbled, thinking aloud. The tray was broken, but the used portion was not the sharpened portion. The spork was used as a handle, its primary function unaltered. The foil was used for polishing. He looked up, a horrifying realization dawning on his face. By every literal definition in the Concordance Examination Code, your actions were legal. A low murmur spread through the examinees. It wasn't a murmur of confusion anymore. It was a murmur of dawning, glorious comprehension. The human hadn't just beaten the test. He'd beaten the system. He'd taken their rigid, unyielding box of rules and used its own corners to smash it open. A loud ding echoed through the hall. It wasn't the failure klaxon. It was a sound nobody had heard during a practical exam in centuries. The success chime. A holographic scoreboard lit up above the platform. Next to examinee human Kyle, a score appeared. But it wasn't just a simple pass. A new category, one that was usually grayed out and dormant, flashed to life in vibrant green text. Module 3 Assessment, Threat Neutralization. Result Pass. Methodology Score, 100/100, Creative Problem Solving and Systemic Exploitation. Bonus points awarded, 50, Exceptional Resourcefulness Under Duress. Total score, 150/100. Scoring 150 out of 100 was not supposed to be possible. The system was not designed for it. It was like getting a 6 on a 1 to 5 satisfaction survey. It was a paradox. Seiler stared at the score, his abacus-like head seeming to shrink. He had been defeated. Not by force, not by cheating, but by a brand of logic so lateral it had looped all the way around and come at him from behind. It was a kind of thinking his species had bred out of themselves millennia ago in favor of orderly, predictable, top-down regulation. "This is unprecedented," he whispered. Kyle, meanwhile, walked back to his seat, giving the tray dish a little flip. He passed Cragg, who looked from Kyle to the fist-shaped dent in the pylon, and then back to Kyle. A slow, grudging smile spread across the warrior's rocky face. It was the Cathar equivalent of a standing ovation. "Human," Cragg rumbled, his voice low with newfound respect. "Your garbage is mighty." Kyle gave him a nod. "Waste not, want not." He sat down next to Gleep, who was staring at him with something akin to religious awe. Gleep's species revered data, and Kyle had just provided a data point so far off the expected curve that it fundamentally altered the entire graph. But how did you know?" Gleep twittered, his voice full of wonder. "It was not in any manual. There is no protocol for weaponizing lunch." Kyle shrugged, setting his creation down. "I'm an engineering student. My entire education is about looking at a system, figuring out its inputs and outputs, and then finding the cheapest, laziest way to get the result you want. The Gormak wasn't the system. The projector was. The test makers wanted me to focus on the monster. So I focused on what was making the monster." This simple explanation seemed to short-circuit Gleep's brain entirely. He just sat there, his 4 eyes blinking in a slow, rhythmic pattern of pure, unadulterated epiphany. He had spent his life memorizing the rules. It had never occurred to him to read the instructions for the box the rules came in. The rest of the exam was a blur. The proctoring staff, thrown into complete disarray, seemed to have lost their will to enforce the more pointless regulations. During the astrogation module, when the simulator's guidance system failed, Kyle bypassed the emergency protocols entirely by using the reflective glare off his tray dish to take a manual stellar parallax reading, a technique so archaic nobody had used it since the invention of subspace sensors. He scored 140 out of 100. For the Xenobotany practical, where they were supposed to identify a poisonous plant by memory, Kyle noticed the air filtration system was subtly changing its hum to filter out the plant's specific neurotoxin. He identified it by cross-referencing the filter's frequency with a public database of atmospheric contaminants. 160/100. The scoring system was practically weeping at this point. By the end of the day, Kyle hadn't just passed the universal competency exam. He had broken its high score. He had set a new standard, not for compliance, but for sheer, unadulterated cleverness. News of his performance spread through the station like wildfire. The human who beat a Gormak with a lunch tray. It was the stuff of legend. In the aftermath, 2 things happened. First, Proctor General Seiler was forced to write a report. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic agony, a 900-page document attempting to explain how a human with a piece of garbage had outperformed the most rigorously tested elite of the galaxy. He had to concede that no rules were broken, but recommended the immediate creation of 4,718 new sub-regulations. The first one, of course, was an addendum to Statute 742b3. The definition of weapon is hereby expanded to include any object, regardless of original design or purpose, that is utilized to focus, reflect, channel, or otherwise manipulate ambient energy fields, including, but not limited to, holographic, thermal, kinetic, and electromagnetic, in a manner that results in the neutralization of an examination simulacrum. Furthermore, the following items are now classified as potential weaponizable components and are to be surrendered before entering the examination theater: nutrient delivery platforms, eating utensils of all materials, foil wrappings, personal hygiene wipes, and any clothing with a reflectivity index higher than 0.15 inch. The second thing that happened was that Kyle was summoned to the office of the station commander, a wise old being who had seen empires rise and fall. She looked at Kyle, then at the mountain of panicked reports on her desk, and then back at Kyle. "So," she said, her voice laced with amusement. "Lunch tray, huh?" "It was a very versatile tray," Kyle said with a shrug. The commander chuckled. "The Xylosian technocracy is demanding your score be invalidated on the grounds of conceptual malpractice. The Kthar have offered you an honorary position in their warrior caste. And the Glipglorpians want to download your brain into their central archive as a holy text on asymmetric thinking. You've had a busy day. I just wanted to get a passing grade so I could go back to my dorm," Kyle admitted. The commander leaned forward. "Son, you didn't just pass a test. You reminded a galaxy full of specialists that sometimes the best tool for the job is the one you make yourself. You taught them that the rules are just a framework, not a cage. The Concordance needs more minds like that. We've been so busy optimizing, we forgot how to innovate." She offered him a position in the Concordance Diplomatic Corps, in a new Special Projects Division dedicated to unconventional problem solving. The pay was good. More importantly, it meant he wouldn't have to take any more standardized tests. Kyle accepted. As he left the commander's office, he walked past the examination amphitheater. A new batch of examinees was filing in for the next cycle. He saw a young Kthar warrior glance nervously at the newly expanded list of prohibited items. He saw a Glipglorpian frantically trying to memorize the 4,718 new sub-regulations. And then he saw Proctor General Xyler, standing by the entrance, his antennae twitching with renewed vigilance. He was personally inspecting each examinee, confiscating sporks and foil squares with the grim determination of a bomb disposal expert. His eyes met Kyle's from across the hall. There was no recognition. No animosity. Just the blank, processing stare of a system that had encountered an error, patched it, and moved on. Kyle just smiled, gave a little wave, and walked away. The system had patched the loophole, sure. But that was the funny thing about humans. They were always happy to find a new one. And as he walked towards the cafeteria to grab a celebratory, non-standardized meal, he found himself looking at a salt shaker on an empty table. He picked it up. He turned it over in his hand. It had an interesting weight to it. A nice, granular flow. The narrator sighs contentedly. Oh yes. This was going to be fun.